is Peter Brennan and I'm Chairman of Bid Management Services. This training tutorial will cover the much overlooked issue of contract management. I hope you find the presentation useful and practical. This video tutorial is part of our Tender Training Excellence program. You may wish to view some or indeed all of the other presentations. Once you complete the Tender Training Excellence program, you will have the confidence and ability to bid to win and to manage the contract successfully. This presentation is based on our new ebook, Public Procurement Rules of the Road. You will find more details about the topics that I will be covering in Chapter 19. Winning a tender is one thing. Managing the contract in line with the buyer's expectations is quite a different issue. It is important, once a tender is won, that it is delivered professionally, on time and on budget. Managing a contract in such a manner will enhance your business credentials and improve your reputation. And such a positive reference can be put to good use the next time you bid. What is contract management? Well, from a buyer's point of view, it involves a process that enables a supplier to deliver on the tender requirements in a transparent and professional manner, based on a full mutual understanding of the legal contract signed by both parties. It also encourages a supplier to be innovative and to deliver value for money. It involves active intervention in terms of the supervision of contract fulfillment from the perspective of the buyer. And contract management also manages expectations. And finally, secures the required outputs from a buyer perspective. There are many reasons why buyers and suppliers end up at odds over their respective interpretations of what a contract is delivered and is done so in line with the RFT requirements. For example, the supplier discovers that the low price strategy to secure the contract was a false economy. Another problem are the under-resourcing of the delivery team. This happens quite frequently. The buyer, having reviewed several unsuccessful bids, then decides to revise the technical specifications or the desired outputs, but does not allow the preferred supplier to adapt the budget necessary to cope with these new requirements. Another problem is that the supplier is overwhelmed by the new contract, perhaps because of other business commitments. And finally, the buyer adopts a too relaxed attitude to contract management, and this does and can give rise to problems. Section 10 of the standard template for supplies and services contracts, published by the Office of Government Procurement, leaves quite a degree of discretion to the buyer in terms of contract management. The primary obligation that suppliers must comply with is to liaise with the buyer and to address any issues which the buyer has and, at its discretion, agree project milestones and key performance indicators, KPIs as they're called. In contrast to the approach adopted in the UK and Northern Ireland, contract management is light. What is best practice? In the UK and Northern Ireland, specific guidance has been issued about the principles of contract management that must be implemented across the public sector. The organisation responsible, the Crown Commercial Service, has developed contract management principles that are a set of cross-government principles that underpin the approach to contract management and departmental contract management with supporting guidance and manuals. They've also developed a contract management summary based on the National Audit Office's Good Practice Contract Management Framework, which dates back to December 2008. In addition, the Contract, Supplier and Innovation Management team at the CCS has developed a suite of contract management standards and templates which are being rolled out across the UK and Northern Ireland's public sector. While a similar set of instructions does not yet exist in Ireland, suppliers could be mindful of these principles when fulfilling contracts for Irish buyers. For larger and certainly for more complex contracts, you might consider preparing a project implementation plan, a PIP, in close collaboration with the buyer's appointed project director. The PIP, the Project Implementation Plan, is in effect a non-contractual service level agreement with the buyer. A typical PIP will translate your proposed solutions into agreed work packages with defined milestones and deliverables. It will also stress test your capacity to deliver. In drawing up a project implementation plan, it is not at all unusual to discover that the buyer has a quite different set of priorities, having assessed the bid responses of your competitors. So your proposals may need to be tweaked and perhaps recosted. Preparing a PIP prior to the start of project implementation therefore eliminates surprises later on. And if you produce a common and an agreed PIP, you and the buyer will start with a mutually agreed set of common objectives. A service level agreement, on the other hand, is a contract between a service provider and a customer, a supplier. It details the nature, quality and scope of the service to be provided. And as it is a legal document, it is quite different from a project implementation plan, which does not bind the parties. There are four main principles that should be observed when agreeing service level agreements. The service level agreement should be, firstly, reasonable. Setting high service levels may, in fact, entail higher costs. Service levels should be prioritised by the buyer, and a ranking using terms such as critical, major, urgent should be used. Service levels should be easily monitored and therefore measured and capable of quantification. And service levels should be readily understood by the staff of both parties. So a service level agreement allows the buyer to monitor and control the performance of the service provider against mutually agreed standards. The main advantages of a service level agreement from the buyer's perspective are: minimum acceptable service levels are agreed. There is a clear emphasis on what the service will do. Possible changes to the service can be anticipated. KPIs, key performance indicators, are included. And finally, buyers have a heightened awareness of the cost of service delivery. Well, sometimes service level agreements fail, and they fail because the buyer seeks to include everything possible in the SLA and endeavours to set out the requirements in far too much detail. Sometimes includes matters that are not measurable. Also, setting unrealistic KPIs is a problem. SLAs are most successful when they are embedded in an agreed approach by both parties to the continuous improvement of the levels of service delivery. From the outset, both parties need to assign a nominated individual to act as project manager or project director. Both project managers should have their respective roles and responsibilities defined in either a project implementation plan or a service level agreement. For instance, the buyer's project manager might be required to fulfill the following tasks: contract award negotiations, agreeing a service level agreement with the supplier, day-to-day management from the buyer's perspective, performance setting and the monitoring of KPIs, convening of all project meetings, attending same and reporting on the outcomes, and internal and indeed external communications. The supplier's project manager would have counterpart responsibilities. It is not unusual in more complex contracts to have two layers of project management, with a steering group directing the project team from a strategic perspective and a project implementation team responsible for day-to-day delivery. A detailed risk register should be prepared post-contract award in consultation with the buyer, as it is the buyer who will have to make decisions on the proposed mitigation measures. The risk register should list all the identified risks and the results of your analysis and evaluation to identify these mitigation measures. So the risk register should underpin all your activities. Knowing in advance the probability of an occurrence and adhering to the recommended mitigation action should prevent unforeseen incidents that have the potential to delay the project and, of course, add costs. If large risks loom, consider the appointment of an experienced risk control manager as part of your project implementation team. The risks register, which is very much a live document, should be reviewed at monthly project team meetings and adjustments made as and when necessary. Now to the controversial issue of TUPE. Based on the European Community's protection of employees on transfer of undertakings regulations that date back to 2003, that protect employees' rights when the organisation for which they work or the service they contribute to the delivery of transfers to a new employer on the award of a new tender contract. It applies to organisations of all sizes, both in the public and private sector. It is not possible to contract out of TUPE requirements, but the commercial risks and liabilities relating to a transfer can and should be managed. Despite the huge importance of TUPE in Ireland, there are no detailed guidelines about this important issue. It is very important that suppliers are fully aware of TUPE employment liability to allow them to factor this into their bid strategy and cost proposals. If this information is not fully and accurately disclosed, this may result in tenders that take insufficient account of employment costs, resulting in the supplier being liable for additional costs post-contract award. Contract key performance indicators are a win-win option for both suppliers and buyers, provided that both sides approach the setting of KPIs in a realistic manner. KPIs allow both parties to assess the success or otherwise of contract delivery. The buyer will have determined the desired outputs in the tender specification, but may have left open the precise definition of quantitative targets. So the first task on contract award is to discuss the desired KPIs with the buyer in an open manner. Each KPI must be capable of measurement. Agreed metrics are much more preferable to vague outputs. Each KPI must be realistic and time limited, and indeed KPIs should be flexible during the duration of the contract. Buyers are required to sign off a contract when it is completed. The buyer needs, therefore, to be sure that the delivery of the desired outputs has been done to the standard set in the request for tender. To be satisfied that the supplier has met his contractual obligations, and to have regular reports to hand that address all key aspects of contract delivery. And finally, to be alert to actual or potential problems. Suppliers and buyers should not only include a schedule of reports that need to be prepared, but agree the outline content of such reports. For example, a monthly written progress report would be a sensible approach on condition that precise inputs are agreed, for example, in the project implementation plan. Ideally, the project implementation plan or service level agreement should enclose reporting templates. Face-to-face meetings every quarter would be best practice. Most contracts are managed at meetings between the parties. It is quite surprising, therefore, that some buyers can take quite a lax view when it comes to recording the decisions taken. The project implementation plan or service level agreement should therefore set out precise requirements about reporting requirements, which should be proportionate to the value of the contract. At a very minimum, the following should be agreed. The types of meetings that are needed. For example, progress reports every 6 months and monthly operating meetings. The frequency of these buyer-supplier meetings. Who will chair and convene these meetings? Who will record the decisions? And who is expected to attend from both sides? It is not at all unusual in the course of contract delivery that the buyer decides they need additional services, supplies, or works. So much so that there are important precedent cases at EU level which found that where, quote, material changes, unquote, are envisaged, the contract must be re-advertised. Otherwise, the contract could be treated as an illegal direct award. Buyers must comply with strict rules under the new EU procurement directives if changes to a contract are being contemplated. Buyers and suppliers need to be extremely careful when it comes to contract changes where there is substantial change. The primary contractor is responsible for ensuring all the subcontractors and members of the bid consortium deliver what is promised in the tender response. The request for tender will usually ask the primary contractor to indicate in the bid response any share of the contract it may intend to subcontract to third parties and proposed subcontractors. Subcontractors may be asked to complete some forms. And after contract award, buyers will be asked to verify the details, or should I say suppliers will be asked to verify the details of their proposed subcontractors. Once the contract is signed by the primary contractor, all members of the consortium are jointly and severally responsible for contract performance. The buyer and supplier should then proceed to conclude an agreement, perhaps based on the PIP, that will define in detail who does what, when, and to what standards. To ensure that all subcontractors perform, it will be prudent to convene a steering group of these partners, chaired by the primary contractor. The PIP, or the service level agreement, should also determine payment terms and conditions between the buyer and the supplier, and between the supplier and his subcontractors. If a subcontractor underperforms or is unwilling to remain in the bid consortium, it is the responsibility of the primary contractor to find a suitable and equivalent replacement. The glue of a good consortium is trust, and trust thrives when there is open communication between the parties. Contract management needs to factor in, therefore, two types of communication: internal communications between the project team and their respective organizations, and external communications such as social media. Suppliers should therefore consider the following menu of options when making recommendations about internal communications. Should a project website or app be used? Could this website enable the making of payments or fees that have to be collected? Could an internal, secure, password-protected extranet be used for all internal communications? The extranet should be designed to present data and financial information in a manner preferred by the buyer. And all users in the project should be allocated project-specific email addresses. In relation to external communications, it would be quite unusual for a supplier to be allowed to have direct access to the media. The buyer usually deals with these inquiries. One of the most critical issues to agree with a buyer as part of contract fulfillment are payment terms and conditions. So ask some of the following clarification questions about these payment terms and conditions. What are the proposed terms and conditions? Will the buyer accept monthly invoices? Will the buyer accept phased payments? What level of detail will have to be submitted on presentation of an invoice? Is it necessary to submit detailed timesheets for a fixed price contract? The Office of Government Procurement template contracts, I think it's section 3, deals with this critical issue. Finally, make sure the buyer has an approved purchase order before you start work. For any contract above the EU value threshold, it would be prudent to clarify with the buyer the level and frequency of financial reporting that is needed for audit purposes and for project evaluation. Financial management and monitoring arrangements should be set up from the start, and suppliers should get clear guidance from the buyer as to the format of the data that needs to be presented with each invoice. Linked to this requirement is the tracking of budgets against agreed KPIs and the identification of potential savings where such a commitment was made in the bid response. The task of financial management and monitoring should not be underestimated. Beware that the European institutions have particularly demanding conditions when it comes to financial reporting, and it would not be at all unusual to set aside 5, 6, 7% of total costs to meet EU audit requirements. Despite everyone's best intentions, disputes do arise. The main reasons why disputes can arise and often escalate are as follows. Firstly, there is a growing divergence between the buyer's expectations and the supplier's delivery of the contract. Ill will builds up between the parties and is allowed to fester. Personality clashes are another reason. The buyer interferes with contract delivery. There are disagreements over proposals for contract changes, and frequently there is miscommunication. Section 11 of the Office of Government Procurement template contracts covers contractual disputes. There are two types of alternative dispute resolution that are envisaged: mediation and arbitration. You should become familiar with both. And our tender tip: pay far more attention to the issue of contract management in your tender bid response. And on contract award, conclude either a project implementation plan or a service level agreement. I hope you found this presentation useful, and a lot of the topics mentioned are covered in our book, Public Procurement Rules of the Road, Section 19.